If we can welcome everyone back, please. If I could invite folks to take their seats, please. Our next panel is about to start. I know it's really difficult to stop your conversations, but I'd like to invite everybody back to the room and on your seats, please. Yes, thank you. This usually works better at the university setting, but I seem to not be doing so well in this room. But it's exciting to see how much energy has been generated after our first two conversations. And I'm excited to welcome you all to the second panel in the day, which is about the emerging security architecture in the Indo-Pacific. We have a really dynamic set of panelists. Two of them are joining us online, I believe from Washington, D.C., and then we have, of course, two here in the room. Let me begin by introducing our colleagues who are joining us online. They're very fortunate to be avoiding the weather here in Ottawa, but thank you so much for being with us virtually. We have Dr. Zack Cooper, who's with the American Enterprise Institute, where his research focuses on the U.S. security strategy in Asia and in the Indo-Pacific. He also looks at U.S.-China strategic competition. He is a lecturer at Princeton University and has done tours of duty, shall I say, with the Pentagon and the National Security Council in the White House. We also have Yuki Tatsumi, who's with the Stimson Center. Her work focuses on Japan-U.S. relations, as well as she directs a project on Japan, I believe, as well as Japan-U.S. relations. Before joining the Stimson Center, she also worked for the CSIS, also in Washington, and the Embassy of Japan in Washington. Thank you both for joining us online. Here in the room, we have Professor Andrew Latham, who just made it in time, so thank you so much. Barely, yes, I hope it wasn't weather-related. He's a professor of international relations at the Macalester College at the University of Minnesota, but I believe you're Canadian, so.
I'm English, Irish, I have 4 passports.
All right, well, we'll get to that in a minute, but hopefully I could turn to you when we talk about Canada in this conversation as well. And he teaches courses on China's grand strategy, as well as geopolitics, strategic competition in the region as well, and a number of other topics and books. And then finally, last but not least, all the way from Singapore, we have Karthik Nachiappan. Close? Yeah. Close. We had this conversation off stage. Karthik is a Canadian, but he's based currently in Singapore, and his work focuses on geoeconomics of India, as well as India's foreign policy. He's just recently written a book titled "Does India Negotiate?" which I'm really excited to pick up and learn about. Okay, so with that just short word of introduction, you have the bios of everyone in your programs, and you can look them up, a really distinguished set of panelists. The conversation is about the emerging security architecture. And I guess just as a way of level setting, because everybody probably knows much of this, but just really quickly, the security architecture in the Indo-Pacific is a little bit different from one in the Atlantic. There's no collective defense mechanism like NATO, but what we do have are a set of bilateral alliances that the U.S. established after the Korean War, where the U.S. kind of served as the hub, and then you have these spokes. So the model was called hub and spokes. Some people also called it the San Francisco system. That lasted for a number of years, and of course, after the Cold War, we also saw a number of multilateral mechanisms, some of which we discussed in the previous session, which focused on ASEAN. These were, of course, the ASEAN regional groupings that we've mentioned, and of course, Canada, in the first panel we heard, is interested in joining a number of them, including the defense ministerial meetings, plus, which we're not yet members of. And of course, this entire kind of fluid architecture is now under threat, largely because of 2, maybe 3 things. One being, of course, the rise of PRC and the kind of the challenge that offers to U.S. leadership in the region, and the statements that we've heard, particularly from President Xi Jinping since 2014, in terms of kind of calling these bilateral structures relics of the Cold War, really saying that security in Asia should be by Asians and for Asians, essentially pushing the US out. And then, of course, the second element is really the role of technology and what it means for the US to be able to project power all over the world, and particularly so far away as the South China Sea or East China Sea, and kind of the role of technology and how that's changing deterrence, particularly deterrence by denial, and also kind of what it means for regional actors, Australia and others, to be able to deter a more powerful China. And then I guess the final element, and I'd be curious to hear our US partners speak about this, is the Trump factor, if I may, or what will happen to the US if there is a Trump 2.0, what would that mean for the region, and sort of are some of these efforts that we're now seeing in the minilateral and kind of spoke to spoke, if you will, the allies that are working among themselves, is that a reaction to a potential Trump 2.0 administration? So kind of looking at those three factors. But that's a really basic level setter, if you will, of kind of what are we interested in talking about, and particularly sort of in the next hour and 15 minutes, we'll want to unpack what are the various competing visions for the security order in the region, particularly sort of looking at US, Japan, Australia as kind of the, I guess, the steering committee, if you will, of the Western perspective, and then obviously looking at China with its partnerships. It doesn't have allies as such, but it does have partnerships with Laos, Cambodia, Pakistan, Iran, Russia. I may have missed one, but and so what that looks like. I'll also like to hear maybe folks reflect on Canada and where Canada fits into this emerging security architecture, and what more can we be doing through our Indo-Pacific strategy. So that's kind of what we're hoping to do by way of introduction. And maybe if I can turn to you, Zack, I'll do kind of a Washington perspective first. 2023, well, 2022 and 2023 were really busy years for the Biden administration. Maybe you can give us a highlight of what has been achieved through these minilateral groupings, AUKUS, Quad, and also the Japan, US, Australia trilateral cooperation. Kind of give us a state of what has been achieved and where are things looking to go in 2024?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me, Vina. It's really wonderful to be here. I wish I was there with you in person despite the weather, but instead Yuki and I are stuck here in Washington. But let me just provide a couple of thoughts before turning it over to the other panelists. So I think that 2023 was a pretty remarkable year, and it's not over yet for the Biden team. They did a lot in a pretty short period of time. And just about a year ago, the administration had promised that this would be the biggest year in a generation for US defense posture in Asia. And I will admit that I was skeptical when they said it, and I think they've delivered. So we started the year off in January with a big US-Japan announcement, which Yuki could go into much more detail about, but some major new announcements about the US and Japan cooperating in Japan's Southwest Islands, doing some new technology cooperation. We followed it up with visits by leaders from the Philippines, from Korea, who also made some major new announcements, including something called the Washington Declaration between South Korea and the United States. Followed that up with some new posture announcements by the Philippines and the United States, with the US gaining more access to facilities in the Philippines. And then a series of meetings, including a Quad leaders meeting between US, Australia, Japan, and India. The Prime Minister of Australia just recently coming to the United States, the President of Indonesia coming to the United States. Obviously, the US hosted the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit in San Francisco just recently, where Xi Jinping met with Joe Biden. So we have seen a huge amount of action, and that's not even to mention some arrangements with Papua New Guinea, some new meetings with the Pacific Islands. So this was a pretty remarkable year. I think the reality is that next year will be much more quiet. it will be hard to get Joe Biden out of Washington, D.C. He will be pretty focused on either being in Washington and dealing with a pretty difficult Congress or being out on the campaign trail. And it may even be hard to get him over to Asia at all, given the scheduling requirements. So this was a big year for the Biden team. They have a lot to show in terms of advancements on defense relationships. I think the big hole, and I'm sure we'll talk about this more, is on trade. And this is what much of the region has been asking for. Touched upon it a little bit earlier today. The U.S. doesn't really have a trade policy at the moment, and that's what a lot of our friends are looking for. And we didn't deliver one just a few weeks ago at the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit. So still some homework left to do for the Biden team, but a lot of progress that they made in the last year.
Thank you so much, Zack. And we will come back to the issue of linkages to the economic agenda. Maybe just one thing that I didn't ask, but maybe you could give us the overall vision of the U.S. when it comes to conceptualizing the security order. We spoke quite a bit in the previous session about ASEAN and the idea of an inclusive security arrangement, inclusive institutions in general, one that essentially brings in China. So when we talk about inclusive, we're really talking about including China. Could you actually spell out what is the U.S. vision for security in the region, sort of the some would call it antagonistic, that it's against China rather than with China, but I'd like you to maybe explore that theme a little bit.
Yeah, I hear this often from Chinese friends that the U.S. Institutions are exclusive of China. I'm not sure I see it quite that way. I think part of what's happened, it's not so much that the U.S. is excluding China from these institutions, is that Chinese behavior is creating a counterbalancing group. And that those countries, it's not that they're excluding China, they're actually actively balancing against China because they're concerned about Chinese behavior. And so it's not that they're excluding Beijing, it's that they have to balance against Beijing's actions. And so that makes it pretty hard to include Beijing in those groups. So whether that's the Quad or this AUKUS arrangement with the United States, Australia, and the United Kingdom, I think you're right that many of these groupings, another one would be the Trilateral arrangement with the US, Japan, and South Korea. They don't tend to include China. A lot of that, though, in my view, is not because the U.S. has arranged these groupings so carefully and kept China out. It's because the purpose of the groups is to balance against behavior that these countries are worried about. Now, let me just say a quick word on inclusivity. If you go and look at the U.S. strategy for the region, the Indo-Pacific strategy, it talks a lot about inclusivity and openness. So I think you'll find this buzzword in what the U.S. says when it talks about the region as well. But I'm not sure that either the U.S. or China really have a fully inclusive strategy that would include the other. I think both of them are competing for friendships within the region, and we're going to see that play out over the next few years.
Great, thanks, Zack. And before I come to you, Yuki, maybe I'll bring in Karthik in this because on the issue of kind of balancing against China, this is where we're seeing India come in, and particularly through the Quad. Maybe you would want to weigh in on sort of how does India see the emerging security architecture and the Indo part of that Indo-Pacific?
First, thank you so much to the IPD and the Canada West Foundation. It's great to be here. So for India, India's security interests almost all boil down to China, managing, deterring, containing. They won't say containing, but constraining China's rise. India doesn't want to live in a regional order dominated by China. And it's engaged in different kinds of activities, diplomacy, whether it's bilateral with the United States, Japan, Australia, minilateral, the Quad. It's figuring out new ways to balance and deal with China's rise and presence. Now India is not generally regarded as a Pacific actor for a long time. That's because the Indian Ocean is India's primary interest. And a lot of India's security thinking and logics come from securing the Indian Ocean from Chinese activities, Chinese interference, Chinese naval forays. And I think over the last year, India has really moved ahead a lot in doing some of that. The naval budgets increased by 22% in 2022. They're investing in technology, so coastal surveillance. They're figuring out ways to enhance maritime domain awareness through the Quad, but also with other actors. The cooperation with extra-regional actors like France, for example, is increasing in the southwest part of the Indian Ocean. So India is really trying to protect and secure the Indian Ocean from external interference, largely China, but it wants to have the Indian Ocean to itself. I think more than that, I think over the last year or so, India's relationship with China hasn't really improved. It's been in a state of stasis. It hasn't really.
Canada can relate.
Yeah, they're in a situation of, I would say, armed coexistence across the border. India hosted several major events this year. The Chinese president avoided that. So there's very little high-level diplomacy going on because they're still unable to deal with the border. And so India is trying to figure out, okay, in the absence of that, how do we figure out the diplomatic configurations, arrangements, partnerships to balance China as much as possible? And that's essentially the strategy and how it looks at the Asian security order. Over the last few years, India has become much more active in the Pacific part. It's engaging much more with not ASEAN, but specific ASEAN countries like Vietnam, for example, Philippines, Indonesia. So it's become much more engaged bilaterally, not so much regionally. It still has concerns engaging multilaterally on a security basis, and that still lingers. Besides that, the partnership with Japan has really increased and has become much more important to India. Same thing with Australia. So Australia, Japan, and the United States all have 2+2 arrangements with India. So defense and foreign ministers speak often. And all of that also feed into discussions in the Quad. So there's a lot happening with India in the Pacific, but the Indian Ocean is what India really cares about and is focused on.
Which is quite remarkable, actually. Having grown up in Afghanistan, to me, India was always much more interested in continental issues and its issues with Pakistan. So it's really amazing to see this change in India really becoming a naval power and wanting to have projection of its power in the Indian Ocean and also with countries in the region. So it really is a change. And I think you're absolutely right that balancing of China and the kind of fears of Chinese interference in the Indian Ocean is creating a lot of alignment for why the Quad is even happening this time around, as opposed to a few years ago when it was first conceived. Maybe if I could come to Japan, South Korea, and the US. I know in the Canadian context, we have Japan and South Korea is really deep relationships and a concept of North Pacific and really interested in working with both countries. But I think this past year, we saw something really quite remarkable under the leadership of the US in Camp David and with the summit of bringing the two leaders together. Maybe Yuki, you can speak a little bit to that and what that has meant in deepening security architecture in the region to have those three working so closely together.
Absolutely. Good morning, everyone, and thank you also for IPD and Canadian West Foundation for this great opportunity. And I'm so sorry, I would have like Zack, I would have much rather be there with you all, despite the weather, than being stuck in DC and having to be bombarded with the U.S. domestic political news, but such is life. And thank you for your question about the U.S., Japan, Korea trilateral. I think that is really one of the major development this year when it comes to a U.S. strategy toward Indo-Pacific and specifically more narrowly focused on Northeast Asia. Camp David Summit was truly historic in the nature. Place of the meeting, Camp David really stands for something. It really, it is a symbol of moving forward, future-oriented agenda, and putting the difficult times behind whoever is involved. As we all know, Japan and Korea has had some very difficult period in their bilateral relationships under the previous Korean president, Moon Jae-in. But it really has taken a drastic turn after their incumbent, President Yoon, came into the office and really reoriented Korea's foreign and security policy, really anchoring itself much even more strongly with the bilateral alliances with the United States, first of all, but then also outlook on Japan as well. President Yoon was very clear, even before he became a president, that once become a president, he will prioritize enhancing the relationship with Japan. And he has truly followed up with what he said. And his very politically courageous moves in a couple of the difficult issues that Japan and Korea had, and under the Korea's previous administration, really also moved Tokyo as well. So that really led to Prime Minister Kishida inviting President Yoon in the summer for a G7 summit in Hiroshima as a special guest, and two leaders jointly visiting paying their respect for the memorial of the Korean resident in Japan at that time who perished at the time of atomic bombing. And that really was a very symbolic scene. If you can, Google the image of two leaders, bowing heads in front of that memorial, is a really powerful symbol of two nations coming close together and try to move forward in the future-oriented agenda. And I think Camp David Summit really cemented that. Significance of that summit is that under the U.S. hosting, President Biden's hosting, three leaders got together. They shared they confirmed their shared concern, whether spanning on every possible area of the policy, everything from economic security, like supply chain resiliency and critical technology, into foreign policy coordination, into a security cooperation. That summit really symbolized that three nations are really on the same page now when it comes to its outlook on the region and its outlook on how the international order should look like moving forward, which is anchored in the universal values such as democracy, respect for human rights, market access, open trade, so on and so forth. So that really was the most important thing that I think came out.
One of the things, Yuki, one of the things that most commentators wonder about is how sustainable are these achievements and whether or not they're transition-proof in terms of change of potential leadership in Korea or even in the US for that matter. So maybe if you could briefly speak to that,
Sure.
That would be great.
So I think that is where the significance comes in. The cementing the three countries' relationship at that leaders level, and they now have a joint document talks about the shared vision, specific steps among the three countries. Then that really actually will work as a safeguard to make this relationship sustainable and livable through the political transition in all three capitals.
Great, thank you very much. Maybe before we go deeper into all of those issues, I'll bring in Andrew to speak about how China views all of this. We've been speaking a little bit from the perspective of the US and its closest allies. How is China seeing the emergence of all of these minilateral arrangements, the Quad, AUKUS, all these trilateral cooperation arrangements in the region? If you could just offer the Chinese perspective, that would be great.
So I never like to speak for China, but
if you were to try to.
they see this as, and President Xi Jinping has been pretty clear about this, they see an imposition of a Cold War 2.0 mentality. The words encirclement and containment are constantly referenced by President Xi Jinping and his subordinates. I think this is a gigantic mistake on the part of the United States. Neil Ferguson famously talks about Cold War 2.0. If you impose the framework of Cold War, and I would just remind everybody that George Kennan famously talked about containment as a means of bringing down the Soviet Union, right? It wasn't just a means of containing them, it was a means of ultimately crushing that regime. And that's the way the Chinese leadership thinks about America's grand strategy. It is a containment strategy intended to bring down the regime in Beijing. And maybe not terribly surprisingly, they're not happy about that.
Great, thank you very much. And in the spirit of a discussion, and I really welcome all of our panelists to react to each other as well and to have an interactive conversation. I know we're standing between you and lunch, so we'll try to keep this as engaging as possible. So to China, this is containment. US obviously doesn't see it that way. Zack, maybe if I could get you to weigh in terms of how is that not what the US is doing, and also where should then US closest allies kind of end up on that spectrum, with potentially Japan and Australia the closest, then maybe another layer South Korea, and then maybe another layer, and Canada kind of finds itself somewhere in one of those orbits. If you could speak to that, it would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a healthy disagreement on this is worthwhile and important. My view is that the Biden team has not tried to contain China. In fact, if you listen to what they say, they explicitly don't use the term Cold War ever. They've tried to get very far away from this framing. They have said over and over again that their strategy is not designed to alter China's form of government. It's not designed to hamper Chinese growth. The problem is that Beijing doesn't believe this, right? And look, understandably perhaps, but I think when Xi Jinping talks about there being a competition of systems, that's a viewpoint that probably is shared in both Beijing and Washington, right? That the United States and China, we have two different systems. They are not trending together. They're, if anything, trending apart. And I think leaders in Washington tend to believe that this is a competition and that we're going to see which one of these systems can better deliver both for their people in China and the United States, and potentially security and prosperity around the rest of the world. So I think the US strategy is actually not so much predicated on what's going on in China right now. It's really predicated on showing that the US can be a good ally and partner to its key friends, especially in the Indo-Pacific region. Now, just final thought on this would be, if you look in, the good discussion on India, I think is an example of this. If you look at China's claims of encirclement and its frustration with the actions that countries, including countries like Canada, have taken, I think you can usually find an incident that predated those actions that triggered a change in policy. And it wasn't usually pressure from the United States. It's usually an action that China took that pushed that country a bit too far, right? The Sino-Indian border dispute with New Delhi, economic sanctions on Australia, economic sanctions on Japan, on Korea, disinformation and pressure on Taiwan for quite some time that shifted the debate in Taipei. Same thing in the Philippines, to some extent in Vietnam. And we could have a long discussion about Canada as well, right? Where I think the two Michaels were a pretty important element. Now, in most of those cases, the US really didn't have much at all to do with those incidents. So I understand Chinese feelings that there's sort of American encirclement, but I think if you look at what's actually happening in some of these countries, it's more like self-encirclement by China that's triggered this response from countries in the region.
So you, instead of giving credit to Biden diplomacy, you're giving credit to China essentially in making this happen. That's humble from a US perspective. I don't know if Yuki or Karthik, you want to weigh in on this as well?
No. Yeah, I will weigh in just a little bit. I like that term that Zack used, self-encirclement. That's a good one. I do also agree that compared to Trump administration, right, the tone coming out of Biden administration definitely shifted. It is really no longer Cold War, no longer decoupling. It's more about de-risking. So Biden administration remains, pretty frank about calling China out for its behavior, but it doesn't really mean that it doesn't want to work with China on any issues. Quite contrary, I think U.S. has tried to reach out to China in terms of Commerce Secretary visited China, Treasury Secretary visited China. So they really clearly see the importance of stay engaged with China. But where it does not compromise is on these security, more of a security policy questions. That aggressive behavior in South China Sea, aggressive behavior toward Taiwan, those are the things that it would not kind of yield to. But I have to agree with Zack. I think that even Korea, I think, is one of those countries that really chose its path, aligning itself closer with the U.S. and its alliance and security partnerships as a result of some of those aggressive behavior coming out of Beijing.
Thanks, Yuki. Karthik?
I think Zack's absolutely right. If you look at what's happening in India, at least until 2020, India was commonly referred to as an evasive balancer. So it was trying to balance China through the Quad, through the U.S.-India partnership, through other military exercises and so on and so forth. But at the same time, it was equally accommodating. It was trying to work with China multilaterally in the G20 and in other global forums on climate change issues like that. It refused to call the Quad for a long time. Right. It was calling it the India, Japan, Australia, U.S. partnership. It was very hesitant on issues relating to Tibet and the Dalai Lama. So India was very, very accommodating until the Galwan incident in 2020, when they realized that accommodation is not getting us anywhere.
And do you think this is going to be an enduring phenomena, or is there any potential for change in India's?
I think the problem for a lot of Indian policymakers is that the Chinese don't really take India seriously. They look at Indians as an adjunct of the United States. And they look at they look at India as a stooge of the United States. And they don't really care much about India's own national interests, its sensitivities, its own positions in the Indian Ocean and how China has been behaving there. And so that's a common lament you hear in New Delhi. And since 2020, India has actually turbocharged what's been happening at the Quad. It's been doubling down, as I said, on the 2+2 arrangements with Quad partners. It's increased its engagement in Southeast Asia. It's spending more on defense. So all of that goes back to the border crisis in 2020.
That's great, thank you. If I could throw another difficult one at you, Andrew, and you can weigh in on everything we've discussed so far.
I've got lots to say.
Sorry?
I've got lots to say.
Excellent. Well, maybe a way to look at it, again, connecting this to the previous panel on ASEAN and the perspective of countries like Indonesia, for instance, which are not necessarily fully in sort of China's camp like Cambodia and Laos would be, but definitely do worry about what's happening in the region. Maybe if you could speak to that, and as well as whatever else came up for you in the conversation.
Yeah, I'm not going to speak to that. I'm going to speak.
Well, maybe I'll get someone else to weigh in.
So I'm a big fan of alliteration and multipolarity, minilateralism, but especially multi-alignment, which is the Narendra Modi official grand strategy for India. And then to depart from that, I also want to talk a little bit about détente. I think it's possible to misanalogize and bring that Cold War frame to bear. But it's also, I think, since this, especially the APEC summit, there's really been an attempt on both the Beijing and Washington to dial down, right? It doesn't mean that there's an end to the structural conflict any more than détente meant, back in the late 70s, early 80s, meant that the Cold War was over. But there's a dialing down. So that's the D. Now let me get back to the 3 M's. Multipolarity, huge debate in the academic world about whether we're in a new Cold War era or whether it's more multipolar than that. I think we're in a multipolar era in which there are a number of great powers, the US obviously, China obviously, but also India obviously. And I think we need to, personally, I think we need to view the current geopolitical reality through that lens rather than a bipolar Cold War lens. I think that's a mistake. Minilateralism. Lots of Quads and AUKUSes and things like that. Not NATO, right? That's, again, the wrong frame. That's not where we are. These are very sort of, to use the agile arrangements. And we're seeing more and more of this. So that's another reality that we have to come to grips with. And then multi-alignment. This has been the Narendra Modi grand strategy for India for, 8, 9, 10 years. India has positioned itself as a leader of the global south. The I in BRICS is India, so it's positioned itself as sometimes aligned with Beijing. And also, it has positioned itself as a partner, not an ally, a partner with the U.S. in terms of balance of power politics in that region. I like the multi-alignment frame. I think that actually illuminates exactly what's going on in New Delhi. Not entirely in the U.S. camp on Team USA, not entirely on Team China, well, clearly not, but also this positioning as a champion of the global South. I think that's really important as well.
Thank you. And we have two sort of India experts, and we have two folks in Washington talking about U.S. Maybe then one thing, since there seems to be quite a bit of agreement, I think, by and large, in what you're saying, if the U.S. has now been able to achieve quite a bit of alignment with its closest allies, certainly Japan, South Korea, Australia, and others on the threat perception and the objectives of its various visions. I guess if we could go into what would that look like from the execution perspective, especially if there is an actual contingency, be that in South China Sea or East China Sea or Taiwan Strait. And maybe if we could get into the practicalities of what that looks like, and maybe again, either Yuki or Zack, if you could start us from your perspective.
Sure, I'm happy to jump in, and then I know Yuki and I have talked a lot about this, so we may have similar views, but we'll see. First, I just want to say I agree with everything that Andrew just said about multi-alignment. I have a big report coming out on managing multipolarity, and I think that framing is exactly right. And it's important because, earlier when I was saying that I think a lot of Americans look at this as a bipolar competition, I think that's true, but I think we should look at it as a multipolar competition. And it goes to the question you're asking, Vina, if you ask simply what countries would be involved directly in a conflict, let's say over the Taiwan Strait, it's a really small number of countries, right? Potentially the United States, depending on who the president is and what their decisions are. Potentially Japan. I think Japan would be, likely to be involved if the U.S. was involved, given how many forces the U.S. has in Japan, and the fact that if American forces were attacked in Japan, that would mean that Japan would have a self-defense commitment as well. Beyond that, I think you start getting into pretty murky waters. Maybe Australia, maybe in some very specific situations, you could have participation from some NATO members, right? UK, potentially Canada, but I think that kind of participation would be pretty limited, depending on the scenario, of course. But I think we should be careful not to equate alignment with the US on a cross-strait conflict with sort of alignment broadly, because in my view, what the US has to do a lot better job of is what you were talking about in the previous panel, which is engaging in Southeast Asia, where these countries have a lot of choices to make. And it's not as simple align with the US or align with China. They can work more with Japan. They can work more with India. They can work more with the EU or with BRICS or the G7. There are many, many options open to those countries. And I think, as Andrew pointed out, the simple sort of choice of are you going to align with the US or not if it comes to a cross-strait conflict sort of boils us down to one very small element, which is a security decision. But I think for most countries, they're trying to make decisions across security and economics and technology and global governance issues. And because of multi-alignment, they may make different decisions in each of those areas, right? So they may align with China on the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, and then align with the US on security or technology issues. And that's going to be really common. And to be frank, I think it's something that Americans are not very used to. We like things a little bit more black and white. This is very much in the gray zone. It's very murky. And I think we're still struggling to figure out how to deal with it.
Great, thank you. Anybody else want to add to that, or any different perspectives, either here or from Yuki? We have extraordinary agreement on this panel.
Yeah, no, I would just like to add that it's really in that murky waters that the strength of the partnership is really going to be tested. Other than that, that is really, in a sense, it's in a weird way, but it's really not the actual kinetic incident that'll test it, but it's in that before it becomes kinetic and how each partner positioned itself and what it can bring to the table in that very fuzzy, murky period is really where the strength of the partnership or lack thereof might expose itself.
Great, thank you.
No, I mean, just want to second what Yuki and Zack said. There was an article earlier this year from Ashley Tellis on this particular issue, whether the United States can rely on India in a potential Taiwan crisis.
Yeah.
And he was basically saying no, right? We need to get more realistic about India's role in the security architecture, no matter its relationship and the progress that it's made with the United States over the last 10, 15 years. India will still be driven by its own interests, which largely remain China and the border. And
balancing
Taiwan
of
remains
China.
and Taiwan remains an economic, not a security issue for India. And on the Quad, I mean, interestingly, I was in a regional crisis simulation earlier this year, and I was playing India, and the issue of a Taiwan crisis, a straight crisis, came up, and I was discussing with my Quad partners on whether the Quad will come up and at least come up with a statement on the Taiwan crisis, and we could not. And it was not just India that was holding back; it was actually Japan that had serious reservations on coming up and releasing a statement strongly on a potential crisis. So it goes to show that a lot of these even mechanisms like the Quad will be tested in the event of a Straits crisis.
Great, thank you. Andrew, anything?
I couldn't agree more.
Excellent. So then moving on in terms of, obviously these relationships will be tested if there is something, if something were to happen, either in Taiwan or in East or South China Sea. I guess the question then for me becomes, how likely is it that our deterrence is going to work? I mean, obviously, U.S. and other allies are doing everything we can in the face of a more aggressive and more powerful PRC and the capacities that PLA has. If you had to kind of predict and or speak to the issue of in the next 10 years, are we going to be able to avoid something happening in that region? Where would you kind of weigh in on that, and what are some of the things that you're considering as you think of that question at 3 a.m. or just as part of your regular jobs? And anybody can begin. Yuki, Zack, Andrew.
I'll jump in very quickly because I dodged your last question.
That's all right.
I like the concept of prudent balancing as opposed to containment and the whole bipolar. Just carefully and maybe even imaginatively blunting China's moves to assert its at least regional domination, maybe global, but I don't think that. I think it's China's looking to dominate regionally. Just carefully and prudently balancing, and that sounds like a trite-ism, but I'm looking back to the European balance of power politics of the 19th century. That's the model rather than a containment strategy or a, yeah. So.
Great. Zack, do you want to build on that?
Sure. I think the idea of trying to have, a balance is exactly the right one. And I would just say there's a lot of debate in Washington and maybe some in other capitals about timelines, right? About whether China might take action in 2027 or 2032 or
2026 is not taken. I think that's the only year not taken is 2026. Right.
Yeah, that's right. And somebody will take it next because having an exact date in your news story gets attention. My personal view is just that there's not a lot of evidence for these timelines arguments. Of course, Chinese leaders are saying that they want to have the capability to operate against Taiwan in 2027. They said that in 2022, and it just so happens that the next 5-year plan ends in 2027. So, of course, they're giving a 5-year mark. We shouldn't put too much stock in that. I think what's critical is that we try and find a way so that we don't trigger a conflict unintentionally, by which I mean, I think in the last few years, you can look at a lot of actions that the United States has taken and some that Taiwan has thought about. And you can see that there's sometimes more symbolism than substance. In other words, we haven't done that much to bolster Taiwan's defense capabilities, and yet we've talked about doing a lot. And so we've sort of gotten all of the bark with none of the bite. And my view is that what's needed now, and I think this goes to what Andrew was saying, is maybe just more focus on the actual defense capabilities that are needed and a lot less talk about those capabilities. There's certainly some in Washington who want to do that, but it's tough with our politics. And so I think that's what we would need to see in the next few years to make me feel confident that we're doing the things we need to do to deter rather than urge on a conflict.
So
just-
speak softly
just-
and carry a big stick.
Well, the porcupine model, right?
Right,
Yes.
right. Yuki, did you want to weigh in on, will deterrence hold and what can we do to make it so?
I hate to sound, I hate to keep saying I agree with what's been said, what everybody said already, but I have to repeat the sentence again. And especially what Zack said about we probably should switch from talking about big rhetorics to focus really more on how we can really effectively deter the aggressive actions. And certainly on the Japan part, I think that does mean Japan probably need to explore more quietly, because this is diplomatically sensitive, more opportunity to have a real dialogue with Taiwan on what these murky situation could mean for both sides. How would Japan work with Taiwan to get Japanese citizens out if something is going to happen, or if, for that matter, is it only Japanese that Japan is going to do that, or do we also offer U.S. too because of the nature, proximity of the place, and then that will mean that the U.S. Japan and Taiwan may start having these conversations quietly. I don't think we have to do it in public forum, but some of those conversations that really needs to happen so that if something deterrence falls, everybody is semi-adequately prepared to respond. But at the same note, though, I think it is right. Porcupine model is the model that actually Japan's exclusively self-defense oriented defense posture we're supposed to do. I think jury's out that it has been successful or not. But I think that is really where we need to put our focus on, and not so much talk so sensationally about, well, is that 2027, 2026? I mean, using those specific date was useful in the sense that it gave political leaders a sense of urgency, that this is really a serious issue, that you just cannot keep kicking the can down the road. But I think beyond that, I think we need to really focus more on the practicality of it.
Great, thank you. Andrew, anything, or we can move on?
I like the porcupine model.
Sounds good. Perhaps one thing that we haven't discussed yet, and it would be useful to bring into the conversation, is the situation with Russia's reinvasion of Ukraine and how that's being viewed in the region, and also what people are making of the growing partnership, the friendship without limits between Beijing and Moscow, and again, what would be the implications for the region. And I guess in comparison, because I think, again, I suspect that this panel will be in fair agreement on what Ukraine has meant for the region, but I'd be curious whether you have thoughts of, in addition, what does the situation in Gaza mean for the region and for U.S. leadership and credibility, especially when it comes, again, to issues like rule of law, and we talked about the rules-based order in the previous session and so forth. So maybe if I could kind of throw all of that on the table and see what you want to pick from that and where you want to take the conversation next, I'd appreciate that. So anybody can begin.
Can I just say a few words on that, and then I'll be quiet for the rest of the
You don't have to be. You don't have to be. We welcome everyone's thoughts.
Beijing's balanced diplomacy approach to the Middle East, in which they tried to be, a helpful interlocutor between the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Iran, for example, and were also positioning themselves to do the same with Israel and the Palestinians. The Gaza war has undermined that. They have decided, Beijing has decided, as part of its grand strategy of positioning itself as a leader of the global South, to throw Israel under the bus. And to me, that's a sea change. That's a hugely consequential change that was inaugurated or initiated by this war in Gaza. China's positive balancing, that's their term. Balanced diplomacy, that's their term. I think that's gone. That's not the way they're approaching the region anymore.
Thank you. Other thoughts on either Gaza and what that means, or Ukraine and what that means for the region, or even the kind of growing sentiment that we now hear from EU leaders in particular, that it really is no longer useful to think of the world as divided into multiple theaters, that we really are all operating under one strategic theater. I don't know if you want to weigh in on those issues. Zack, go ahead, please.
Sure, I'll just add a quick thought about that. So I think there's a bit of a danger of suggesting that somehow Russia and China are sort of one challenge. They're two very different countries with very different interests, with leaders who are quite aligned at the moment. But I think it's pretty clear that eventually, it could be quite a while, Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping will be gone, and the new leaders may not have quite such agreement on how they see the world as Putin and Xi do. And so I don't actually think we're in a world that is sort of one theater, as some people have said. And look, this shows in the discussion we were just having, right? If we were in a China contingency, who would be there? Well, I think most of NATO would not, right? And for good reason, right? NATO's primary challenge as a Euro-Atlantic organization is in the Euro-Atlantic area, and that's not going to change. So my view is we have multiple theaters. It's not just two, but if you're talking about NATO and the Indo-Pacific, those are two of them. And of course they're connected, but I don't think they're the same, which is why I think there's been some understandable discomfort when some in NATO have tried to sort of shift NATO to look much more at the Indo-Pacific and much more at China. Of course, there's got to be some discussion about NATO's role in the Indo-Pacific and how Indo-Pacific countries want to engage with NATO. But I'll just put my cards on the table here. I worked at NATO for a little bit about 10 or 15 years ago when we were spending a lot of time, the United States, trying to convince NATO to focus on out-of-area operations, which meant making sure that NATO could operate in Afghanistan in particular. And the result was, after a whole lot of effort, we got a little bit more capability to do that, but we lost NATO's focus actually on the Euro-Atlantic area where we really needed it now. And so I think it would be a bit of a mistake, especially with a major war ongoing in Europe, for us to talk too much at the moment about Indo-Pacific action by NATO. I think NATO has to stay pretty focused where it's needed right now, which is in Europe. But just one final comment, that doesn't mean that Europe isn't an incredibly important player in Asia. I just don't think that's going to happen through NATO. It's going to happen through the EU. It's going to happen through G7 mechanisms. It's going to happen by individual EU member states, by the UK. But I think NATO as a construct is likely to stay as this Euro-Atlantic organization, and that's okay. We just need to take that, accept it, and move on and think about how Europe can contribute more in the Indo-Pacific.
That's great, thank you.
Yeah, I just want to jump in just to kind of second and echo what Zack said, because I think we've been doing that all, the whole panel. On the Russia question, I think India doesn't want to see a weak Russia. Mm-hmm. India doesn't want to see Russia become a vassal state to Beijing. It's concerned with growing military cooperation between Moscow and Beijing because of the implications on the border. So that's the balance of power that they care about from New Delhi. Mm-hmm. It's a balance of power between that they can, with Beijing, like Moscow is a really critical component of that. And on the NATO part—
Is that changing at all, and given how Russia vis-a-vis China is becoming a weaker, more junior partner? Are there discussions in New Delhi in terms of what does the long-term plan for India-Russia relations look like, especially partnerships in the defense sector?
Well, I think most people in Delhi realize that long-term there's not going to be much of a defense relationship.
With Russia?
With Russia. It's more of a geopolitical attraction. It's a geopolitical— multipolarity. They need Russia to remain an independent, strong pole to deal with China over the long term. I think India knows that the relationship in terms of defense that'll matter over the long term is the one with the United States. And there's been a lot happening over the last year in that front.
And also France, right?
A little bit. A little bit, but more so on the maritime front. And there was some discussions on nuclear cooperation, especially with AUKUS, and given that the French
That
were
went really
jilted.
well for the French.
And so they were hoping that the French would come in and provide India with a different, like with nuclear technologies that it didn't provide Australia. So, but that conversation hasn't really gone much further. And on the NATO part, absolutely. I think if you go to Southeast Asia and look at a lot of the conversations that you hear on NATO becoming much more active and Europe becoming much more active in the Indo-Pacific, what you hear is that we want Europe to take care of itself, to take care of its own security problems, and to resolve the intra-European differences on security before it thinks about what it can do in the Indo-Pacific. And that's the kind of dominant view you hear from Southeast Asia.
That's great. I'm conscious before opening up the floor to questions from you guys, and I hope everyone has questions. Because we're in Canada and because a number of us are interested in Canada, maybe I can switch the conversation there. And we've mentioned a number of minilateral groupings. Canada is not a party to either the Quad or AUKUS, or obviously does not have any kind of trilateral arrangements with Japan and South Korea as we wanted to, but have bilateral relations with many countries in the region. Maybe if we could speak a little bit to how should Canada conceptualize the emerging Indo-Pacific security architecture and the security order in the region. And specifically what I mean is, again, in the earlier panel, we heard about kind of the multilateral approach and the idea to strengthen multilateral efforts and dialogue and confidence building through ASEAN, and how Canada wants to get into all of these ASEAN arrangements, which we're also not a member of. But increasingly, US and its closest allies, Japan, Australia, South Korea, and to a lesser degree India, are, as a partner, not an ally, are creating alternative structures that, while they're rhetorically still saying, of course, multilateralism matter, but in terms of actually how they're operationalizing their security concerns, it is through these other minilateral arrangements. One would argue, and this is certainly my perspective, that Canada shares the security threat perception that the US and closest allies have, but somehow hasn't actually articulated a strategic vision for how we will be contributing to peace and security in the region if one looks closely at the 26-page Indo-Pacific strategy. So maybe if I could draw you guys out on that topic in terms of what would be your advice for how Canada and Canadian policymakers should start to make sense of the world in this tension that is emerging between multilateral arrangements as well as these minilateral groupings, which we're currently not a part of. And of course, we look with envy to Australia, with whom we often compare ourselves, who happen to be in all of these arrangements, about 20 of them last I counted. So if I could get reactions from everyone on those set of questions, that would be great. Thanks. Yuki, I see you want to go first.
Yes, for a change, I'm going to try to go first.
Please, so that everybody can agree with you for a change, yes.
That would be nice. So I think this is where global warming is actually, I think, bringing Canada closer to us in terms, I'm speaking of Japan, because I was just, Arctic. I think it is a very important strategic area moving forward, whether it's like waterways open up, fisheries, potential energy, energy resources that we all can benefit from. And there is already an Arctic Council, and Japan is also a observer of, and we could certainly see some, in that area, Canada can leverage.
Can you say a little bit more about that, Yuki? Because obviously a lot of us here are excited about the idea of Canada playing a much more active role in the Arctic and the linkages between the North Pacific concept and the Arctic security.
Yeah, so as the waterway opens up, Russia is already interested in, China seemed to be very interested in leveraging that new opened up space as its own strategic asset. And then I think that Canada playing a role in leading a conversation about the code of conduct, if you will, because a lot of, when everything is totally frozen and there's not that much movement going on, that's one thing. But then now, when the ship starts going through, both commercial and fishery. You know, there's a safety issue that's going to get involved. You know, what is the protocol of accident responses? What kind of a collaborative mechanism that the countries that had stake in making sure that space remains open and safe can work on and need to work on. I think Canada is in a great position to lead that conversation because of your geographically very close to that area, but then also you do also have a connection, you know, bilaterally or multilaterally with US, Japan, you know, others who would be interested in making sure that that space remains open and safe, just like we're always try to make sure that Indo-Pacific, Indian Ocean and Pacific Oceans will remain open and safe.
Great, thank you. Zach?
Can I-
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, can I be the first to agree?
Sure, please, go ahead.
You know, Canada is an Arctic power. It's North Pacific power. Is not Australia, and at the risk of committing sacrilege, nobody takes us seriously in all of those regions. And there's nothing on God's green earth that we can do that will make us be taken seriously. This country should focus very much on Arctic security, North Pacific security. Obviously, the NATO connection is there. But beyond that, could we just stop deluding ourselves that we're an Indo-Pacific power? Australia is actually in the Indo-Pacific, which is, of course, is an American construct. It's not a natural thing. I just think we sometimes delude ourselves that we are a middle power. The whole middle power concept has gone away in the last 15 years or so. And at the risk of committing another sacrilege, grow up.
Well, I hope that will generate some debate, either in the room or from other panelists. But I think what Andrew is pointing out to is the difficulty that Canada has at the moment of actually being taken seriously in the Indo-Pacific. And that's what I was hoping to invite everyone to weigh in on. So maybe, again, if I could go to Zack and then to Karthik to kind of speak a little bit about what Canada's role should be.
Yeah, so I think this is a really important debate. And let me say, sort of along the lines of what Andrew said, that I do worry that when I'm in debates about the Indo-Pacific and Washington, Canada almost never comes up.
That's right.
You could list 15 countries before you get to Canada in the debate about the Indo-Pacific and Washington.
That's fair.
Now, I know there'll be some who'll say, look, that's fine. There will be others who say, well, but Canada is, of course, an important player through NATO or the G7 or these other fora. I guess my view is, rather than trying to get into existing groupings, you know, AUKUS or the Quad, I think the question is, what does Canada want to do? What does it want to add? And that's where to focus. So if it's on climate and North Pacific issues, great. I think an issue from an American standpoint that it could be really valuable is critical minerals, right? This is an area where the United States is really concerned. We're looking for friends that can do more on critical minerals. We've talked a bit with the Indonesians about this, with the Australians. But you know, sitting in the United States, Canada is in many ways the obvious fit. And it's a natural fit, not just for the United States, but for a lot of Indo-Pacific countries which desperately need critical minerals and want to be able to have a little bit more diversity in their supply chains. So that's an area where I think Canada could show leadership and it would be really valued in the Indo-Pacific. And I think, just from my personal perspective, this is the way for Canadian leaders to think about how to engage, is to not ask, how do we get into this grouping, but to ask, what is it that Canada wants to do to provide value, and then build around that. So build around the issue, not the group. And I think, for me, critical minerals is an area where I know there's a lot already ongoing between the two governments, but I think it's probably, it's really ripe for greater development.
That's great. Thank you so much, Zach. And maybe Karthik, before you answer this, I also wanted you to think about India. Obviously, Canada-India relations are going through a difficult moment right now, but maybe if you could speak more broadly in terms of how if you were to rewrite or to amend the section of the Canadian IPS that deals with India, how would you do that? And then maybe tie it into what should be Canada's approach to the region.
Okay, that's a big question. Maybe I'm going to start with the previous one.
And gather your thoughts on the last.
Yeah, but I'll try. Whenever I'm in the region having discussions on the Indo-Pacific, there's literally no Canadian perspective there. There's very little understanding on what Canada's interests are in that part of the world. So maybe clarifying that would be good. I know the strategy goes into different areas, 5 different areas, but I still not sure what our interests are in terms of what we're going to do in the region.
So not just show up, but show up and actually express what our interests are, because I think the main message from last panel was Canada needs to show up. But
yep, show up given your own interests and trying to advance them and pursue them through various frameworks, arrangements, diplomatic configurations. Also, what are your strengths? I mean, Zack mentioned critical minerals. Technology clearly is another strength. Cybersecurity is an area in which we can actually work with other countries in the region, especially Southeast Asia. Australia does it really well. It has bilateral, regional dialogues, conversations on cyber. That's something we can explore. All these countries are engaging and figuring out new ways of technology diplomacy. So the United States and the EU are now keenly exploring that with Indo-Pacific partners in different ways. They have the TTC between the European Union and India. The United States just signed one with Singapore, again, focusing on issues like data, cyber, AI, quantum. So if that's our strength, that's something we can think more deeply about, just like the critical minerals aspect. Yeah. On the India part, I mean, it's just, I don't know where to begin on that.
I know that was a tough question at the end of our session, but if you could say a few words, and hopefully we can unpack it later through the conference.
Look, I think, I mean, on India, just like with some of the other countries, we need to become much more strategic and engage with them, given what their interests are, security, economic interests are in the Indo-Pacific, and try to align there, and then work with countries like India, Indonesia, Vietnam, Singapore. So for India, it comes down to China, right? Can we help India deal with its China challenge? We have our own China challenge.
Yes. I was just going to say.
Do our interests align there in any way, either on the security front or the economic front? And think creatively about how we can work with India on that. And I've argued before, I mean, we need to, before this whole thing blew up, we should think about bringing Japan into the table and thinking about in Canada, India, Japan, trilateral, given some of our interests do align on specific issues. So again, get more strategic, what are our interests, and how can we work with partners given their own interests?
That's terrific. We've covered quite a few issues. If there are questions, I know we're almost at time, but maybe we can take a couple if there are. Yes, please. So please get to the microphones. And if you could keep them really short and have a question mark at the end, that would be really great.
Thank you. I'm Pang Hanzhou from China Embassy. I just made a very brief comment. I do not want to go into detail because you talk a lot about China.
Yes,
so many Chinese experts here. First thing is I want to say that nowadays I have a feeling that people are fond of creating, very beautiful concepts, just like, self-circumvent is one of them. and I know that, through this panel, I have a feeling that, people tend to blame everything on China. China does all the mistakes. And this is why, other countries will react.
Right.
But in my point of view is that, our China foreign policy have been always reactive. We see that there are also some, causes and then the effects. People when talking about China's behaviors or assertive or sort of their thing, they talk about the thing itself, not go to the reasons why China will do that in that way. So when people talk about Taiwan, and they said defer China from sort of Taiwan system, what's Taiwan? Taiwan is part of China, and this is why lots of countries have the one China policy. You deter China from what? Is this the interference with China's internal affairs? And when you talk about, Indian Ocean, when China's vessels there, it's deemed as interference into the, Indian Ocean affairs. But when, the Americans, the Canadians ships in South China Sea, this is a sort of safeguard the passage of freedom. So that's the double standards.
Sir, I know our time is limited, so if there's
I
no
know that.
questions.
And also, I don't want to emphasize the last point is that,
Please.
from the panel first, we know that the one consensus of the regional countries is that, no one want to have a new board from all sides. Everyone want to be the master of their own fate.
That's right.
And when the other countries study the foreign policies of the China or the regional countries, they should learn the cultures or civilizations. They have to huge different. The Oriental cultures prefer coordination and cooperation rather than competition or lose and win. And since this is why from the first panel, and people say to how Canada can learn from Southeast Asia. I think people can draw some lessons from that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. That was a perspective from China. Maybe we can get 2 more questions and then we'll just do a lightning round
Can I
of
just
reaction.
quickly respond to that?
Sure.
Very, very quickly. 2 points. The famous Scottish philosopher David Hume once said, if a fiction is necessary enough, it's not a lie. And I think that's the one China thing, right? There are, without getting into the weeds, obviously 2 Chinas. The second thing is, directly to your point, China, PRC, is acting like every other great power in all of human history. It's pursuing its own national self-interest. That doesn't mean that we can't push back, but it's not to demonize the PRC. I just think they're doing what great powers have always done.
Great. Thank you, Andrew. Maybe we'll take the 2 questions and we'll do responses from the panelists to wrap up. Please.
Thank you. Kurt Stimson from National Defense Research. One of the things that the panel didn't really get into that I think is sort of central in this discussion is the PRC's redefinition and the successful redefinition of the security discourse in the region. It doesn't matter what happens when there's an incident of whatever nature, there's an international consistency and definition from the PRC that doesn't exist amongst other Western countries in the region or other local players in the region. And what this means is that the PRC is describing and defining things in novel ways. They're invoking moral justifications, which may or may not be justified. And they're doing it in a way that sort of puts the centrality of the Middle Kingdom on display. And I think when we actually look at what we're doing, as we've talked about this morning, there's multiple sub-regional fora. There's different definitions, strategic ambiguity, which is so ambiguous, it doesn't mean anything to anyone. No one knows exactly what to do with it. And I think one of the things when we actually look at our trying to respond and define what we're doing in the region is that clarity of mission, focus, red lines, and understanding, because we're not doing that, and the Middle China is, and we're at a disadvantage because of that.
Great. Thank you. And final question, please.
Great, thank you. Arthur Smith-Windsor, I'm an analyst at Global Affairs. So my question is primarily for Yuki Tatsumi about the bilateral relationship with Japan, and what are the expectations that Japan has of Canada in the Indo-Pacific? What are the views on the Indo-Pacific strategy? And I understand that there are some areas of cooperation that have been discussed, such as energy, but perhaps you could speak more to what are the possibilities for expanding that relationship and cooperating with Canada. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. And maybe, one final. Yes, please. Okay.
My name is Wenjing Gao, and I'm a PhD graduate from Carleton University. So I have 2 small questions. One is, how reliable do you guys think that India can play a role as a critical partner to Canada in terms of rule-based international order? And the second one is, do you think with India's rise, and eventually it will become China 2.0, and in terms of Modi's more and more aggressive Hindu nationalist government? Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much. And maybe Karthik, we'll begin with you, and maybe you could speak to the India thing, and then Yuki will come to you on the Japan question, and then get comments from Zack and Andrew on anything that you want to mention from all of those questions. Thanks.
on the rules-based international order, I think it's instrumental to India. It wants to use the order to rise, to support its economic and security interests. It's not essential or integral. And so that's how it looks at it. All India wants to do, its ambition is to become a leading power, is to become a pole in the international system, just like the US, China, Japan. And that's about it, right? And that's what it's also striving for. I don't think it really cares. It wants to reside in a multipolar international order. It doesn't really support US hegemony. Neither does it support Chinese hegemony. It just wants to live in a world where India can dictate and control its own security and economic outcomes. That's it.
That's great. Thank you very much. Yuki?
Great, thank you. So for bilaterally in Japan and Canada, obviously there is Japan and Canada actually does cooperate quite closely through actually other multilateral forum. I think G7 is the really the first major framework that comes to mind when it comes to cooperation between the two countries, and they actually have a pretty active summit and foreign minister level engagements, and they often foreign ministers are Japanese and Canadian foreign ministers and prime ministers often have phone meetings, in-person meetings, at the sideline of G7 meeting and APEC and G20. And primarily, though, I think historically, Japan's bilateral relationship with Canada is really kind of focused on the agricultural factor of it, but obviously, in recent years, it has started to have more of a security cooperation aspect of it. However, I think that really kind of Japan does, in terms of political security issues, Japan does look at Canada as a more of a, I guess, a ready state partner, peacetime partner that are still very important. But like, alluding to Zack's comment about, when something happens in Taiwan Strait or Korean Peninsula, even, would Japan expect Canadians to be there? Probably not. However, having a close relationship with Canada and expanding that cooperation, hopefully now into Arctic area, and talk about safety standards and things like that. Having Canada keep interested in what's going on in Japan's neighborhood really does help Japan's own national interest about creating the security environment where both Japan and Canada pursue its own national interest. But a lot of times those are all anchored in a very similar values, so they overlap a lot. But I think I'm sorry, my answer is like a little bit abstract, but that is where I think the relationship is going.
Thanks, Yuki. Andrew, final thoughts? Reaction to any of those?
I get the final thoughts.
No, Zack will speak after, but final thoughts for you.
That deflates me.
I'm sorry. Final thoughts from the room, and then Zack.
Rules-based international order. Well, first of all, norms, rules, and institutions have always governed the relations between different political units. That goes back to the beginning of time as well. But I'm amazed that what until 5 minutes ago was called the liberal international order, right, has been rebranded as this merely rules-based international order, but it's still the liberal international order. Are we, Canadians, Westerners, NATO members, are we going to commit ourselves to fighting and dying for the liberal international order, or should we merely be content with a minimalist, rules-based international order which doesn't actually impose Western values? I'm going to go all academic here, imperialism, doesn't actually impose those on the Indo-Pacific or other parts of the world. For me, I like Latin. Modus vivendi is good enough. I don't need to impose our values and virtues on everybody else on the planet.
Thank you.
Was that okay?
That's fine. And Zack, final word to your reaction to everything you've heard, including maybe the last thing from Andrew here.
Well, first, thank you, Vina. It's really been a great discussion. I think there's been so much agreement, and it's wonderful to see this kind of debate about the Indo-Pacific happening in Canada. It's really welcome. Let me just add one thought, which is that as the United States looks to the Indo-Pacific, and I think we're seeing Washington shift more and more of its attention towards Asia, towards the Indo-Pacific, I hope that what we can see is a closer partnership between the US and Canada as the US does this, right? Sort of rather than looking past or over Canada, that we can bring our two countries along. Not that we're always going to have the same interests or the same desires, but there is a huge amount of alignment between what the United States wants to see, peace and security in the region, and what Canada would like to see. So I think this dialogue is incredibly useful. And just on the very last few comments, I would say, look, the United States is still trying to figure out exactly what we want in Asia, right? You've certainly seen a pretty big variation between where, say, the Obama administration was and where Trump was, and now where the Biden administration is. So I think there's still a lot of room to shape American policy. And I think what's clear, though, is that where the United States has done the best is where it's worked closely with allies and partners. And that means working with Canada and with others. So I think there's a lot of room for these exact kinds of conversations to happen, and not just for Canada to sort of watch as the US goes off in a direction, but to try and shape that direction, because we get things wrong a lot of the time and we need a lot of help when it comes time to reorient. So just thank you so much, Vina. Really wonderful to have this discussion.
Thank you so much, Zack. And this is my turn to completely agree with you on everything you said. I am not going to even attempt to summarize the discussion we've just had. It's been a really rich, but maybe one thing to note, and especially for all of us who work on Canadian foreign policy, and especially as we might look into what might happen in the US with the election next year, that one message is coming out really clearly. US needs its allies and partners, but US needs its allies and partners to actually carry their weight and to do things and to be very clear about what it is that they want and how they want to contribute. So I think the takeaway from the conversation could be issues around the Arctic and really making sure that Canada does engage strategically in the region and also strategically engages with the Arctic and the Atlantic, because while we may not be a big power anywhere, we are in all of those three theaters, and we are a close ally of the US, and we do want to contribute and to be able to pursue our interests. So with that, please join me in thanking our panelists for this wonderful discussion. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Zack and Yuki, for joining us. Have a wonderful afternoon, and everybody here, enjoy lunch. Thanks.